It's been a fascinating day today. It's so many new tools that I can use right away. It's been very exciting. So I'm going to talk about a research project that we've been working on and a method and approach. I think the talk's going to be a little bit different from the other talks today because while I'll be talking about the Metaketa approach, I'll be actually along the way giving you the sense of this actual set of field experiments that we run. I do want to, you see this long list of authors here. That will become clear why there's so many authors. There's actually 5 research teams all doing research in 5 different countries. And of course, the steering committee and my co-PI, Susan Hyde, who's a professor at Berkeley, is there. She's handed over the mic to me today, so I hope I can live up to it. I also wanted to say that, so this took place under EGAP, and Cyrus Sammy was the director of EGAP when it took place. So Metaketa, the way I think about Metaketa, I think other people that have been involved, and this is the 5th Metaketa experiment. And the idea is to do 5 research experiments at the same time in different country contexts and do a meta-analysis of the results. And the practical thing I think about in terms of we were talking about engagement with policymakers and talking about the issues of having large results in one country and then wondering whether it would travel to another country. And I've been in that situation myself. Big effects in Vietnam, would it work in, say, Kenya? And here the question is to actually make that part of the design from the beginning. So you can actually potentially see where it doesn't work and make some sense of the heterogeneity. And I'll talk about that. I think doing it this way does actually make the heterogeneity across the different research contexts very clear, and I think it leads to some, I think, really interesting puzzles and challenges about how we evaluate work. So that's Metaketa. I'm going to go through the specific methodology, but I did want to give you what we were doing in this actual project, which was a women's empowerment program. And so the basic motivation, I think it's hard to read, but all of those different rows are different countries, and you can see the red is men, and the women, and the blue is women, and the green is the difference between the green is the difference between the two. And you can see that across the board, in these 2 areas of non-electoral political participation, have you ever got together with others to raise issues and try to resolve problems? And have you ever contacted an elected official or legislative representative? Across every country, there are massive gaps. Women are much less likely to participate in these non-electoral forms of participation. I could have shown you other ones about attended village meetings, and it matters a lot. We have a number of studies in economics that show that because women, when women are more likely to be represented, public services, infrastructure spending is different. But here across the world, we have this major gap. So the question of our EGAP was, how do we resolve that problem? How do we increase the opportunities for women to participate and actually potentially increase the responsiveness of the politicians to women's demands? There's a large literature on here. Most of the evidence is quite mixed in this literature, both the experimental and the observational work. There's been some work that's shown that extra resources for participation has worked, others that have tried to solve an information gap. I did want to highlight 2 things. Most work is focused on formal electoral participation, but in a lot of countries, and especially in the countries that we're looking at, that is not the most important way that things get done. So, and then the second is, there have been a lot in political science, a lot of studies on responsiveness, looking at how politicians respond. But work on participation that sort of generates that responsiveness, there's a lot less of it that's been published. And when we've talked with funders, there has been a rumored file drawer problem here. Work that has tried to stimulate participation and stimulate the quality of participation has not been published. We don't know a lot about how to operate in this space. All right, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but there's some political science and social psychology jargon that we're using, and so I want to just get us all on the same page. When we say empowerment, we're talking about increasing groups' ability and willingness to influence political affairs. That's what we mean by empowerment. Collective action is really important for us. It's any action undertaken by an individual as a representative of the group and aimed at improving the conditions of the group as a whole, all right? So collective action means a little bit differently across fields, but that's how we're thinking of it. Political participation is acts that aims at influencing the government either by affecting the choice of government personnel or by affecting the choices made by those government. So it can include voting, but it can also include contacting officials, signing petitions, attending town council meetings, donating money. Responsiveness is when politicians hear the signal from their citizens through participation and then respond to them with policy actions. And then perceived efficacy, that's critically important. And here we're borrowing from social psychology a lot, is people's belief in their agentic ability to select, create, and transform the environments in which they live. Now, psychologists talk a lot about two types. So perceived personal efficacy, my ability to do things, but also, and something that's not as common in political science that we've learned a lot about, is collective efficacy. How I feel about the agentic ability of the group I belong to be able to get things done. And they're obviously connected, right? So if I play on the same soccer team as Messi, right, I have high personal efficacy, but my team does well. There's also high collective efficacy, so they influence each other. But that's how we're thinking about efficacy in this study. So the basic theory, we borrow from something in social psychology called the social identity model of collective action. I put model in italics because it's not exactly I think of it more as a framework in the sense that there's these three components and then an outcome to it. It is very similar. It has antecedents in political science. It has antecedents in political public policy. But various authors have tried to distill the main components. And the way to think about it is this. When you want to get a group, particularly a disenfranchised group, to be able to engage in overall collective action, you have to do three things. So first is you have to make sure they have a common identity or group identification. And in our case, just to give you an example of what that means, you have women from different social strata, different ethnic groups. They might not all see themselves as members of the same group called women, right? So the first part is a set of activities that lead to that common group identification. You can think about it across ethnic groups or other groups as well. The second is that they have to have a sense of shared grievances or perceived injustice. That is that as women, they have to see that there are certain things that affect them as women negatively, either in the workplace, in the political environment, that keep them from being able to engage successfully. And then finally is this notion of collective efficacy. They have to believe that they as a group have the ability to change their situation. So when these three things are in common, when they exist among that particular group, then the idea is that you can get overall collective efficacy or collective action across this group. Now, a lot of times when people are working in SIMCA, they're thinking about protests, but remember here, we're thinking about non-electoral forms of political participation. All right, so I think it's unclear. I know there are better psychologists. I'm not a psychologist, nor do I actually work on women's empowerment, but in my reading of the literature, it's not obvious that these are all necessary conditions. Sometimes they're phrased as necessary conditions, sometimes they're phrased as sequential, but it really doesn't matter for us. Our experiment is going to include all three. All right, so what did we do? We borrowed from a set of interventions and then made them, sort of adopted them. One intervention that we had in mind, it actually has a pretty terrible name. For this type of activity, it's called GALS, or the Gender Action Learning System. I wouldn't have chosen that one, but it's a curriculum for women's empowerment that tries to engage in these three types of activities. We built a curriculum around this, and then we worked to create, in 5 different country studies, women's action committees where they were trained on these 3 different aspects of empowerment. So we facilitated these group meetings. Just a couple of things that I want you to know, because I know I'm pressed for time. In some places, there were already women's groups that were active. So we worked with the existing women's groups, so in Vietnam, the Women's Union, but then recruited some new members into those groups. In other places, there were already, we had to create these groups anew. Say, for example, let's see, let me just make sure. Yeah, so we had to create new groups in Pakistan and Nigeria and then recruit new members into those groups. So that we created women's action committees. So the randomization was done at the village level. In control villages, there was a treatment that wasn't facilitated in this way. It was a placebo treatment that was just an information treatment about how things worked in the village and who you would interact with, but it was unidirectional, specifically because we weren't trying not to create those same notions of group identity and efficacy. So the experiment starts with a burn-in meeting. So in each village, there was a burn-in meeting where all potential participants were invited to attend the meeting. And then from that whether that was in the treatment villages or in the control villages, and from there that became our experimental sample. So if you were invited to the burn-in, but that you didn't complete the baseline survey, we still went back and found you and collected data. Women who missed the burn-in but joined at later groups were dropped from the analysis. So the burn-in meeting was the sample. The training, in case you worked like this, so there was the curriculum tried to cover all three types of identification, perceived injustice, and collective efficacy. Now, keep in mind, it's facilitated, it's trying to create that group identity. So, for example, a common activity here was to increase common identity, was what they called activity mapping. So women would put gender-coded cards and put women's and men's name on them to identify what were roles of men and women in that particular society in terms of private and personal sector. For perceived injustice, it was called a problem hat. Women put various problems that they had into that hat and then talked about them as a group to see if there were other problems that women had that were similar in that community. And then in collective efficacy, it actually was a series of sharing success stories about how women could be successful at getting things done, about a process diagram about how you interacted with that community to develop the notion that you could complete these and be successful as a group of women. So here's the DAG for this. So we had 3 outcome variables that we cared about. So we had 1 randomization, 3 outcomes that we cared about. So the level of participation, did we encourage more women to participate overall? The quality of the participation. So one thing that a lot of us had learned in our experiments was that sometimes you could induce people to participate, but not in a way that was super effective because it didn't encourage information that politicians could use. It wasn't phrased in a way they could use. So for example, you might say it doesn't work in our community, but that doesn't actually allow politicians to change the laws in any effective way. And then finally, we looked at responsiveness. So you can see that we had these 3 mechanisms that we cared about the most, that the group identity, the injustice, and efficacy, to see which one of those was causing the effect. But we also were aware that the experiment could generate could have worked through other activities. So for example, it could have helped women increase their informedness about the situation. It could have increased their political network. So we wanted to monitor these other effects that would have gone through the experiment. All right, so I think for those who are mapping our pre-analysis plan hypotheses to our results, there you could take a picture of this, right? So here, we expected positive treatment effects on participation, on quality, and responsiveness. We were also keeping track of these other potential effects, and we were aware that there might be heterogeneous effects. So for example, places with pre-existing levels of women's empowerment, the experiment might work better. Places with pre-existing levels of higher levels of political freedom, it might work better. Now, we couldn't do that across countries, but we did put in place within country experiments to deal with it. All right, so here's I think this is the most important part. This is the research design is Metaketa. So there are five country teams were chosen. We had this single bundled treatment that was doing all of these things. Data was collected. One really important piece of this, following all the highest standards, there were pre-analysis plans that were registered both for every country team and for the meta-analysis team. And then second, we had a red-blue team replication exercise. So each team created their own data analysis from the raw data, but also on our steering committee, an analysis team led by Alex Kopuk recreated everybody else's results from the same raw data. And then after we got the results, we went back and compared those results to make sure that we were consistent and had the same, and then went back to look where there might have been errors across them. All right, so the basic way the experiment rolled out, we were affected a little bit by COVID. Here's when the basic information started for each country and then final data collection. Countries went to the field at different times. That had a lot to do with what the partners' needs were. Some partners needed to get to the field faster. Basic went like this: pilot, burn-in meeting, the collection of the baseline survey, and then an elite survey. I'll talk about that in a second. Randomization at that village level, an elite survey. We had a behavioral measure of grants competition, which I'll talk about in a second, and then the results of the grants. So basic on sampling, where does the randomization take place? The country level was done through a competitive study. So we said we wanted to do this type of project, and then teams put in their proposals to us. So that was selected based on competition, but also because we're trying to see whether results generalize, we wanted to make sure that we were choosing settings that had that varied, but also had this high level of unequal political participation. Second, and this we were coming up when I was saying that experiments were gold-plated. I was talking about this in particular, that we were often choosing the first, like a province or a district, where we were allowed to do the experiment. So the localities were not chosen randomly. But then at that next level, at the unit level, the village level, that's where randomization took place. And teams did it differently. In some cases, they used block designs, and sometimes they used match quartet designs. But at that, so the women within each experiment are not randomized. It's all the women are selected. But at that higher level, the village level, it's randomized. I think I don't want to spend too much time on this, but these are across some freedom of domestic movement for women, property rights for women, and then whether women are represented in the legislature, just to give you a sense of the variance in women's empowerment that we saw before the study, and where our countries ranked on those. So you can see Vietnam ranked pretty highly, in a couple of those on property rights in lower chamber, Malawi on freedom of domestic movement for women. I don't want you to dwell too much on this, but I do want you to see that there are different, that for the most part, everybody was followed the same strategy, but we have different numbers of individuals and different numbers of clusters across teams, depending on the local context. All right, so attrition, we didn't have, so just here on the left is the share of people that were at that burn-in meeting that then answered the end-line survey. You can see that we don't have significant levels of attrition in our survey. Okay, we had three main outcomes. So we had a women's survey, so this is self-reported about their own understanding of level of participation, quality of participation, and responsiveness. We also have an elite survey where we're asking village elites or local level elites about their own views about this, whether they actually observed participation on the part of women. But then finally, those are self-reported, so we also wanted a behavioral measure. And so this was Susan's brilliant idea. So we created, alongside a separate small grants program that was organized by a different group at that local level, and was set to mirror the way public services were actually allocated in that community, where women could put in proposals, or any group could put in a proposal to win a small grant. And a cool part of that small grant was that government officials were actually involved in the selection of that small grant. So here we have an example of women actually doing real participation that we can observe. We can observe the quality through the quality of their grants, and then we can observe the responsiveness by whether they were selected by government officials. Okay, so I just want to be really clear here. So we have three outcome variables that we're interested in: level, quality, and responsiveness, and we're measuring it in three ways. So here's the grants. So whether a woman signed or co-signed a grant from a community that was treated. We're looking at the clarity, relevance, and coordination, and then responsiveness, was it selected? Across the women's survey, we created these three pre-registered indices on level about whether they attended meetings, informal or formal, not our meetings, but village meetings or village councils, whether they had the phone numbers of officials, whether they knew who to contact. We asked about questions about quality, And then we asked about their views of responsiveness. So these are all indexes that were pre-registered before we started. Okay. And then we had the end-line survey. There's a little bit of methods here. We have two different estimators. So the first one is just a straight difference in means. That's what I'm going to present. We also use the Lin estimator, which adjusts for covariates. I won't go into too much detail about it since I'm not going to present it. But it's a way to adjust and reduce some noise for pretreatment covariates. In fact, we have very little difference between our straight difference in means and this adjusted one. Standard errors are all clustered at the women's group level. And then the meta-analysis, again, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's just a straight random effects across those 5 different effects. What I do want you to see is that those confidence intervals on the meta should be a little bit bigger. And the reason is because the meta-analysis is picking up 2 different types of variance. It's picking up the within-country variance, and then it's also picking up the across-country variance in the studies. So you'll see, so you'll see the confidence intervals on that final one is a little bit bigger. But it's a very simple random effects model on the meta-analysis. All right, you guys ready for the results? Can I just ask you, do you think the experiment worked or not? Can I just take a poll? Who thinks this is my forecasting? We actually did the forecasting. I can show you that too. But just put your hands up if you think it worked, that women were empowered. Significant result. Yeah, significant result. Yeah. On which countries? Yeah, that's a great question too. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, you're voting yes. Yeah. Okay. All right. So this. I think you're already asking the right questions. Was it significant overall? And which outcomes, you're going to see there's going to be a lot of interesting results here. So let's look at the first one, the one that I think is the sort of the straight behavioral measure of level of participation. So the way to read this is the percentage of respondents that either signed or co-signed a grant. So see in Vietnam, you can see it's 32% in the control group signed or co-signed a grant, versus 56.7% in the treatment group. So that's, 24.8 percentage points. So really big effect for Vietnam. You also see it's about a 16.3 percentage point effect. For Nigeria, about a 4 percentage point effect. For Pakistan, insignificant effects for Malawi and Kyrgyzstan. And then that meta effect is about 9 percentage points. In case you're wondering, it's a 0.059 p-value on that one. Yeah, if you squint, maybe. Yeah. So that's the meta result on it. So I think the first thing to notice about this, and I'll come back to it in a second, is that we do get results. So I think we can conclude from this that women's empowerment training can increase participation, but not in every place. So then Brian asks, across what percentage of results? So here's this is just that index of participation level, the self-reported measure. And here things differ a little bit. You can see that we have non-significant effects for Vietnam, Pakistan, and Kyrgyzstan, but pretty sizable effects for Malawi and Nigeria on the self-reported measure, and an overall significant meta-analysis measure. On quality of participation, we see very much the same pattern. There's two pre-registered measures of participation. So this is relevance, clarity, and this is, I like this one a lot. There was some coding issues on Pakistan that we're still dealing with. But this one is basically a Herfindahl index of whether women in the treated areas or women in both areas selected the same issues as important. Because one of the ideas we had is that if the training was programmed, they should have coordinated around the same ideas and saw the same things as important, say particular types of infrastructure or particular types of services. So again, we see that in Malawi and Nigeria, self-reported, not in the other places. Responsiveness, we see that same pattern. Again, it's Malawi and Nigeria on the self-reported measures driving the results. Okay, so then the next thing we did, and we're not trying to do any mediation analysis here. We only had one randomization. We're not able to deal with this problem of sequential ignorability. But I did want you to see we collected data, and so we could measure these three important ones of group identity, collective efficacy, and perceived injustice. And then these other ones that we were looking at, self-efficacy, procedural knowledge, whether they had a network or not. The thing that I want you to see here is looking at the mechanisms and trying to match the pattern of the mechanisms to what we saw in the treatment. And two things stand out. So we didn't move the needle very much on either group identification or perceived injustice. From our treatment bundle, the place where we appeared to move the needle was on that collective efficacy, right? And I've thought a lot about this issue. So it could be that in those places where we had effects, it's because they already had high levels of identification and perceived injustice, and so what really mattered was collective efficacy, but I think there's a lot of thinking still to do here. The other place where we moved the needle a little bit was on procedural knowledge, women understanding how their local government worked and knowing who the power players were in it. All right, so I actually have a little bit of time so I can do some fun things, all right? So, okay, so we're still coding. There's so much grants data to code. We never thought we would have this much. There were 2,200 proposals in Nigeria alone, all on paper. So all of that's being coded, so we have a lot of work to do here. So we do have this initial evidence, and I think we can state definitively these women actions committees can work. But very clearly, they don't work everywhere. And here we have some super interesting heterogeneity. So Nigeria has sizable results on both the behavioral and survey measures. Malawi, we have results, but only on the survey measures. Vietnam has very large behavioral results, some survey evidence, and then Pakistan and Kyrgyzstan are generally small results or insignificant results. We'll come back to the heterogeneity if you're interested. Okay, so here's something that Susan and I have been talking about a lot, which I think is very relevant for this conference, which is how to think about these results, right? And so we did all of these 5 studies at the same time. You can see the heterogeneity. Humans are pattern makers. You're already coming up with ideas about how to explain these patterns in your own work. But what I would say is, imagine that these results came out sequentially and how we would see them as a literature. So for example, let's say we observed that large Vietnam positive effect first, right? That would have been a major publication, right? It would have been really high profile. It was an innovative experiment. It worked. If it was a graduate student, they would have got a great job. Maybe they would have defended their territory against other results, the non-results that appeared later, right? So that's sort of an agenda-setting power to that first big result. Or alternatively, what if you had the null result as the start? That might not have been published. We see evidence of publications. It might have affected future opportunities for funding. People would have had real questions about the utility of this experiment. So I think in doing that, you can kind of see some of the issues that we face in terms of the literature, but also I think really interestingly, the real benefits of doing a Metaketa, and it takes a lot of work, but coordinating these field experiments. I did want to show one final thing because it already brought up, which was our forecasting. So we went to gender experts and also non-gender experts, and we asked them to basically rank their possibilities, but we asked them to rank all of the different countries. So if they said all were going to be negative effects, that's in red. Those who said null are coded in green. Those who said all positive are coded in blue, and those who had mixed results, that some countries would be negative and others would be positive, are purple. This is our actual spread in results across the 5 countries. So a few things to see here. Most people thought this experiment was going to be a blinding success. that we would have results across all 5 countries. And most people actually thought there was going to be less heterogeneity than we actually observed in the data. That they actually thought it was going to be successful, and the results were going to be more tightly around each other, where we got a larger variance in the set of results. Yeah, so I have a few minutes, so why don't I take a few questions, because we did do some heterogeneity analysis, and we can also talk about the larger questions about how do you implement something of this magnitude. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. My name is Ayalnesh. I'm a visiting scholar from Ethiopia, SIGA fellow here. My question is regarding empowerment curriculum validation. Was it validated in the context of each study setting, like the studies conducted in different countries? So was the tool validated in the context of each study site? Thank you.
Oh, so. And which tool do you mean, the treatment or the outcomes?
The treatment.
Yeah. So that was a really important part of the effort. So it was really important that they each have a local partner who had operated in that context before and engaged in women's training before and had done it in the local context. And then there was a long effort to write the curriculum for each of these that took into account the local context so it was appropriate for the local conditions. And I mean, that's really important. Gender issues are different. Yeah. And then the final thing is there were pilots in all cases prior to us starting the experiment to make sure that it was appropriate in that local context. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it had to be adapted a lot. And by the way, this is a really hard part. That is like, how do you keep the training locally contextualized to deal with the local issues, but also make sure it's coordinated enough so that you can actually do a meta-analysis and draw out the larger results. And that was a big back and forth that we were constantly meeting as a team to do it and creating some frustration for our local partners, to be honest about it, who had to deal with this in the field and had to deal with changing requirements on their curriculum so we could make sure that we were coordinated.
Thanks. Closely related question. I'm curious because something that we have spent some time thinking about within the Development Impact Group in the World Bank is this issue of like trying to standardize surveys for the same set of outcomes for projects in different countries that are similar but obviously locally contextualized. So I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about like how you create this sort of set of outcomes that you can then, based on surveys, that you can standardize when there are these local variations in the treatment. I mean, variations is maybe too strong.
Yeah.
But
adaptations. So we had an intervention team and a measurement team, and the measurement team, all of representatives from each of the different countries were on the measurement team. And they got together to create sort of a standard common tool with common questions, but then many of those questions had to be locally contextualized. So like, what were the specific sectors that they dealt with? What were the local types of meetings that had to be in there? And so the teams adapted their surveys to the local context from that general instrument. That's how it worked. And one of the things we had to do as teams, as the steering committee, as the teams put in their pre-analysis plans, we had to go back over it to make sure that they were adhering to those two standards of making sure that they were following the common survey, but also making sure it was appropriate for the local context.
Super exciting work. The question that comes to mind is, did you say, thinking of the future studies on participation that are coming up after this, do you have any recommendations, any prescriptions on how to report the results such that they are comparable to your efforts?
Oh, that is a great question. Yeah, that is such an interesting question. Like on the grants one, I would say the grants, I have some ideas about the grants, but it would be hard to do because it does have to mirror the local context. On the surveys, I do think that we were super clear about how the questions were asked and then how they were aggregated, that I think someone could take these pre-analysis plans and do it. I do think we made some mistakes, right? Like in measurement, then we've had to address this through deviations through our measurement plans. So for example, like we tried to create a Euclidean distance measure between what women wanted in the grants and what they said on the survey. And that was going to be an important measure for us. But in some places where no women from a village submitted a grant, that quantity was undefined. And so you couldn't even impute the missing data for it. And so that particular measurement strategy just didn't work. And I was actually thinking about that measure as you were presenting. And I was like, what do we do with that outcome that didn't work? Like, how would we have to deal with it? Like, so I think, we have presented it as will present it as a deviation from the plan. Susan, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, just in general, since I've been involved in all 5 Metaketas to some extent, I think the general idea is like obviously 5 is not enough for a meta-analysis, but the hope is that over time, in some research fields in which people feel as though it's worth continuing to pursue research in that space, that people don't feel the need to continue to continuously innovate in measurement, that at some point people start to measure things similarly over time instead of differently over time, and that we can sort of maybe just have some standardized measures that we at least reproduce those measures, and then if you feel like innovating, you also measure the old measures with the new measures in addition to the old measures.
Yeah. I do think for both the treatment and the measurement, like our goal is to have documentation that's good enough that people, not just researchers, but practitioners could take them off the shelf. Yeah.
Sorry, let's get on a microphone. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So just speaking as a person who has been involved used to be involved in a lot of women's empowerment things, I just wanted to comment that even in groups of women from the same country, city, neighborhood, and even school, we had trouble agreeing about just about anything. So these results are not surprising. And also, I do wonder just like why this is a cross-country comparison, because those seem like incredibly broad categories, and country borders are a little bit arbitrary. So for instance, could you do this just in, say, one region of one cultural context in just Vietnam? That seems to be maybe a little bit more comparable, but I'm just wondering why countries are the unit of comparison.
Oh, that's a great, yeah, I mean, the countries are the way we think about, we could have done it just, and in fact, we did. There's within country variation that we study in the analysis, but I think since you worked in the space, you probably know, like one of the things that happens in this world of international development is a project that was successful in one country. People, like for example, the GALS program has been tried in 40 or 50 different countries that has some success, is then imitated and implemented in other places, right? And so we were trying to take that process and do it at the same time so we could get a handle on those comparisons. And also I do think it's exactly that heterogeneity that is so interesting. Does a similar women's empowerment program that was successful one place, would it travel to another place? Or are there cultural or institutional contexts that would make it less successful? All set? Thank you so much. Yeah.